have to apologise for my voice, but it's nearly there. I'm Dr. Alan Shell, and welcome to this evening talking about my gut feel. Obviously, like many in Australia, we will have variously gut problems, be it wings, cancer, gastrointestinal problems, all those words. We have two excellent speakers this evening, Professor Martin Weltman and Geraldine Georgeou. Before I start, I just want to talk a little about Wolper and the friends of Wolper. You're all good friends because you're here tonight, so welcome. We have obviously been around a long time, Weltman, 50 years, and we want to think of you as our friends. And in doing that, we do have a small but not expensive $30 a year fee that we'd like to keep in better contact with you, so we can let you know about our Wellbeing events, evenings such as Girls Night Out movie and an evening with Adam Goods. Of course, we have the Pulse newsletter, and we want to just keep you up to date with what's happening at the Wolper. We hope that tonight you enjoy this evening, and we'll have another evening in November, which will be on that very important year of genetic coding and all about your genes. Just to be kind to our guests, make sure that your phones are on silent or turned off. Thank you. So this evening we are delighted to have Associate Professor Martin Weltman and Geraldine Georgeou. Martin will talk first. Martin is an Associate Professor, Consultant Gastroenterologist, and in liver disease. Is quite well known in the area of consulting in Bondi Junction, Randwick, and even out the Vegan. His talk tonight will be about the gut is alive. Of course, as always with our evenings, we will have time at the end of both speakers. They'll sit down, they'll be our panel, and we'll take some of your many questions from the floor. So without further ado, I'd like you to welcome Professor Martin Weltman. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you for inviting me. Is this working? People hear me?
No, right now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Better?
Yes.
Yeah. So I've been asked tonight to. I'm covering what I might have thought was important. I'm covering what Ruth thinks is important. So we're going to, and then we're happy to answer any questions. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the gut microbiome, and which is quite a topical thing, quite a big topic at the moment. And I wanted to emphasize some of the points. So what I'm going to try and emphasize tonight is where we have evidence for things, where there's some scientific basis, and perhaps what we don't know and what conclusions we should or shouldn't jump to. So the gut microbiome is quite diverse, and it can be diverse within and between individuals. So at different stages of one's life, or different through different events or circumstances, your gut microbiome can vary, and it can vary quite widely between all of us here. Our diet, particularly what we call macronutrients, and our dietitian may elaborate on that, has a major role in the composition and activity of these complex microbiological populations. So how diet influences it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Our knowledge is quite limited, actually. There's a body of knowledge that exists on the effect of carbohydrates, but less so for fat and protein. So there's some decent level of science around carbohydrates alone, but this is still an incomplete body of knowledge. There is an impact of environmental factors. So lifestyle factors, which I'll elaborate a bit upon, and how the microbiome changes when different environmental impacts occur. So there's probably over 1 trillion microorganisms in most of our guts, and the bulk of these microbes are bacteria. So there are other microbial organisms that are not bacterial, and the majority are found in the large bowel. So their main function is they contribute to the fermentation of undigested food components, particularly carbohydrates that are part of more complex fibre and contribute to fecal bulk. So we colonise our gut shortly after birth. Our gut becomes colonised. Babies delivered naturally have a higher gut bacteria than those delivered via caesarean section, and it suggests that the microbiome, or how we acquire these bugs, it happens during childbirth, immediately during the process of childbirth. Interestingly, by about the age of 2.5, the gut microbiota is pretty much the adult gut microbiota. So it changes a bit in the first 2.5 years of age. To the growth and development of the microbiota is important to, we know, in terms of the developing immune system, and it's influenced by breastfeeding. So babies that are breastfed tend to have a broader microbiome. In the infant gut, a little bit different to the adult, the lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, you don't have to remember these fancy names, predominate in the infant gut. In adults, about 90% of the content of the bacteria is part of these two species of phyla called Bacteroidetes and Firmicutes. So there's two main groups of bacteria, but the other 10% is probably quite important as well. So when infants switch to solid and varied diet, there's a decline in the main two ones we see in infants, and they become a small percentage of the total bowel microbiota. And you would remember by the age of 2.5, about 3, they pretty much have an adult microbiome. Smoking can impact, and so there's data now on smoking. A lack of exercise, there's data on a lack of exercise, and both of these affect the microbiota, but both of these are also risk factors for colorectal cancer. And we shouldn't assume that the change in the microbiome is what causes the colorectal cancer. It may contribute, but it may not. But those studies have not been done. Stress affects the microbiome indirectly, because stress affects how the colon moves, the motor activity of the colon. And it also impacts on the gut-brain axis. So messages that come out of the gut will have an effect on the brain, and vice versa. When we're stressed and anxious, most people are aware, at even a superficial level, the impact on the gut. And the change in the movement of the motor activity of the colon will be impacted, will change the microbiome profile. So what that means, we don't know, but it changes that profile. And that in turn may have an effect on the brain. There's some evidence to suggest that. So we know the brain-gut axis from other work unrelated to the microbiome is bidirectional. So the brain affects the gut, and messages, neurological messages coming out of the gut affect the brain. And they're both well-established hormonal and neurological pathways. But it's now thought that the gut microbiome that is altered under stress may influence this brain activity and have a negative or positive impact on mood. So, obesity, there are changes in the microbiome with obesity, but we don't know if that's related to obesity per se, or because obese people tend to do less exercise. Is it related to the lack of exercise, or is it related to the diet? So no one knows what really happens, but it creates the type of microbiome that's more considered to be more pro-inflammatory. Geography is important, so in rural Africa as opposed to urbanized Africa, they have very different microbiome populations. So in rural Africa there's much more fiber, less refined carbs, and they tend to have a broader microbiome. What that means, no one really knows as yet. We think it's healthier, but we don't really know. Travel. So a lot of us go traveling. We might go away for a few weeks, for a month, for even longer. There's a change in the microbiome, and how significant that is, both short-term and long-term, is not well understood, but we know the microbiome does change. So, carbohydrates are the principal carbon and energy source for microbiomes we see in the colon. Fiber is both preventative, so high fiber, and therapeutic for many large bowel disorders, as well as non-bowel disorders such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, obesity. We know that, when we've known this long before we knew much about the microbiome, that fiber promotes good bowel health and it increases digestive or fecal mass. Incompletely fermented fiber increases mass really through its physical presence and its ability to absorb water. An increase in the digestive mass, so if we have more digested fiber and fecal material, dilutes toxins, it reduces intracolonic pressure, and it shortens travel time through the colon in most people. And it increases defecation frequency. So, many of these health benefits of fiber are now thought to be related to the fermentation of the fiber by the colonic microbiome, and it produces a whole lot of metabolic reactions that are beneficial in this regard. So it's not the fiber itself, but it certainly may be the change and the benefits to the microbiome in the bowel. So, the other feature of the gut microbiome is that it produces a large number of what we call bioactive. They act with the biology of the human compounds that can influence health. So it can make certain vitamins like folic acid and vitamin D, which are beneficial, but it can also make products that are toxic to human health. And so the balance between these two is very important. We've seen an increasing amount of research looking at the host immune defenses along the intestine, including the mucus barrier which exists, which prevent potentially harmful bacteria from causing damage to underlying tissues. And there's a lot of research now showing that certain part of the microbiome, the normal microbiome, hangs around this area under this mucus barrier and along the junctions between the cells, which we call the tight junction, and protects harmful bacteria or their toxins entering those cells and entering the human body. So it would appear, but this is quite a broad statement, and the evidence isn't all there, that the maintenance of a diverse and thriving population of beneficial gut bacteria keeps these harmful bacteria at bay. And they actually compete for nutrients that both groups want, the bad guys and the good guys, at the site of colonization. So if you have more of the good guys, they're going to get the better nutrients and they're going to be the more vigorous and stronger bacteria. So dietary means, and the evidence is really there mainly for a range of fibers, at a very simple level, is probably the best way of maintaining a healthy gut microbiome. So, what the points I wanted to make is we know in some situations, which are well established, there is an interaction between the microbiome and the host. And there may be millions of situations that haven't been studied, but these are very obvious examples that make people who research this interested in this area. So some are well established. When we eliminate part of the normal microbiome with antibiotics, with broad spectrum antibiotics, the stage is set for a baddie called Clostridium difficile, and we all have Clostridium difficile that's contained within our microbiome, but they become, the bad guys in this Clostridium difficile group become much more powerful, and they lead to an antibiotic-associated diarrhea, and at its most severe end, it's called Clostridium difficile colitis, which is a very serious condition, and people get hospitalized, they can become quite unwell and need very significant medical treatment. Similarly, in newborns, particularly in preemies, they're prone to this condition called necrotizing enterocolitis, where they get this bad, destructive inflammation of the small bowel and colon, and there's evidence now, very good evidence, that a lot of this intestinal inflammation is a result of disturbances of the microbiome in the less developed microbiome. In another situation, we get bacteria where they simply should not be. So we have movement, which we call motility of our digestive tract, and if it's impaired, particularly in situations where acid secretion is dramatically reduced, it's an environment which allows the proliferation of organisms in the small intestine where we don't have many organisms. They're normally in the colon, and they get small bowel or small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and it's associated with quite a lot of bowel and gut symptoms that are quite unpleasant. Not serious, but unpleasant. So these are well-defined conditions. There are probably lots of other less well-defined conditions that we don't know about, but this has led people to go and research these various pathways and disturbances, so we gain more knowledge. So, our gut microbiota produce a vast range of products, fermentation mainly of fiber, but to some degree of protein is very important. It keeps our gut physiologically alive, and it produces these short-chain fatty acids. And they're a key source of energy for the colorectal tissues, as well as for the bacteria that live there. And they promote those bacteria that help maintain tissue integrity and protect us from the bad guys. These small-chain fatty acids do reach the circulation, and it's normal to reach the circulation for them. And in the laboratory, we can show they improve immune function. For example, in the lung, it's been shown they reduce inflammation in lung tissue. So at quite a distant site. However, I said before that this fermentation can sometimes produce bad things if we have the wrong setup, and it can produce ammonia, phenols, and hydrogen sulfides, which if absorbed through our bloodstream are quite toxic and cause significant ill health. We produce all these gases. You all hear about methane, hydrogen, sulfides, etc. And these are byproducts of the fermentation within the gastrointestinal tract. When we produce excessive gas, that'll cause bloating, and sometimes a change of diet can ameliorate that, and we may ask Geraldine about that. We know that this particular group of bacteria produces anti-inflammatory compounds. How significant that is in day-to-day life and the clinical situation cannot necessarily be extrapolated. This is all laboratory or animal-based research. We know this group of bifidobacterium can potentially prevent infections because it produces acetate that kills some of the bad infectious common bugs. So, there's growing evidence of the role of diet and environmental factors in modulating the composition and the products the human microbiome makes. So that's important. And we know replacing a habitual Western diet with one in high fiber can quickly change the fecal microbiome. So that's something simple that most people can do. Some people can't cope with a high fiber diet, but most people can do. And this change starts occurring within 24 hours if you increase your fiber. So There's a lot of talk about prebiotics and probiotics, so I thought we'd bring that in, and this isn't a comprehensive talk on either of these. It's just to highlight the context for this. And there's prebiotics and probiotics have shown to increase selected, and I use the word selected bacteria, to typically these bifidobacterium and lactobacillus. But the change is relatively small no matter how much we consume, and they only persist for as long as you're taking these probiotics. So 48 hours, it's all gone if you stop taking the probiotic. This is the big issue though, and we shouldn't resolve from that. Definitive proof that any identified alterations from taking these probiotics or prebiotics, there's no definitive proof that any of these are directly responsible for host health. And generally our understanding of that remains elusive. We think all these things are good for us, but there's no definitive proof. So we've discussed some of these concepts. They have practical relevance, but they're simplistic given our current limited understanding of a very complex and dynamic interplay between the host and the gut microbiome. So really it's quite a complex thing, and we often boil this down to very simplistic messages. We, for example, hear advertised on the radio and TV, and none of this is simple. There's a trillion bacteria in your bowel, so it's not going to be simple. Prebiotics, as opposed to probiotics, are dietary substitutes that selectively promote proliferation and activity of so-called beneficial bacteria which are indigenous to our colon. So essentially, by definition, they are selectively fermented ingredients that result in specific changes in the composition and or activity of the gut microbiome, thus conferring benefits upon host health. So that's the definition. There's some work to show they improve bowel and immune function, metabolic health, and importantly, mineral bioavailability in humans. But the evidence isn't very strong except for an improvement in bowel habit and colonic uptake of calcium and magnesium. There is mounting evidence, mostly from laboratory work, that prebiotics both directly and indirectly modulate the immune system and potentially reduce the risk and severity of bowel infections and inflammatory conditions. Geraldine, our dietitian, may want to mention these, but these are some of the prebiotics that we talk about. So there's a big emphasis now on a move towards resistant starch, particularly in the diseased bowel. So resistant starches occur naturally, and I'll leave to you. Will you elaborate on that? So that's something where there's an increasing evidence, and there are now longitudinal studies that are being planned. Some of them are literally going to be a whole generation before we know the results. For example, as an interested audience in Tel Aviv at the Sackler University, the Department of Pediatrics, the Gastroenterology department, are looking at people who are at risk for ulcerative colitis through various genetics and familial studies, treating them, randomizing them to eat whatever they want versus a specific diet, and part of the diet is rich in resistant starches because they believe that generates protective bacteria. So so they're treating it like a drug trial, and where they're comparing it to the standard of practice, which is if it was a drug, it would be the standard drug we use versus the new drug. This is comparing people who are randomized to a regular diet versus a diet that's altered to alter the human microbiome. And we'll see. We're not going to see for another 20 years what the results of those studies are. So we need to be watching the space because it's going to change. What's going to help us gain a lot of knowledge. We've heard about the Human Genome Project, so now we have the Human Microbiome Project, and they're people from Australia who sit on this executive and manage this project. It'll probably be in the future be very personalised to the point that we may, for example, look at the the DNA of our microbiome and say, at this age and at this stage of the life, you're missing this bit of the DNA, and the pharmacist or someone will make that up and put it in a specific capsule that won't release its ingredients until it gets to the colon. It will probably land up being something like that. But there's a lack of controlled trials that are needed to determine the influence of diet on inflammation and the causation of gut and other diseases that we think may be related. And we shouldn't resolve from proper controlled trials. We expect and we want pharmaceutical companies, and we hold them to high standards that they do this, and it should be the same for any therapeutic intervention. So that's about the gut microbiome. I'm been asked to talk about gluten, and I think I'm going to refer some of this to Geraldine. But I want to separate celiac disease and so-called non-celiac gluten intolerance. So celiac disease is a well-defined and serious illness where the body's immune system attacks itself when that individual eats gluten. This results in damaging of the lining of the small intestine. It means that as a consequence of that damage, the body cannot properly absorb nutrients from food, and there's a whole lot of consequences of not absorbing those nutrients. It's not a food allergy or an intolerance. This is an autoimmune illness. And it's a common problem. So it's a lifelong illness. Once you diagnose it, you can develop it at any age of life. So it's more commonly develops in younger people, but it can literally develop at any age or stage of life. Probably in Caucasian populations, 1 in 100 people have this condition. In Australia, we probably know about 1 in 500, so we're missing a lot of people. And there's only one country in the world where they have mandated screening for celiac disease, and that's Finland. So the Finnish government, they don't have privacy laws in Finland, and everyone has to comply, and all the data is released. So they know every single person with celiac disease in Finland. And they have reached just under 1 in 100. So there's a variety of symptoms, and this is not a comprehensive talk on celiac disease, but it's just to highlight what we know. Bloating, diarrhea, constipation, vomiting, stomach cramps, mouth ulcers, fatigue is a big thing, and anemia. If undiagnosed, there's a risk of complications including anemia, osteoporosis from malabsorption of vitamin D and calcium, miscarriages, a variety of neurological conditions including ataxia and neuropathy, and although rare, there's a increased risk of small bowel cancers and lymphomas. So, once diagnosed, these people are on a lifelong gluten-free diet. There's a skin equivalent, which is called dermatitis herpetiformis, and it's a specific skin condition that people with celiac disease may have. So, in the healthy small intestine, we all have these finger-like projections which we can just see when we do an endoscopy, but we may see under the microscope called villi, and they help us absorb nutrients. They have these extra tentacles of absorptive tissue. In celiac disease, they become damaged and flat, so they limit absorption of nutrients. Diagnosis is suggests a blood test, followed by a confirmatory biopsy of the small intestine. And there are now treatments and various therapeutic agents that are currently under investigation, not to cure this illness, but to either put it in remission so people can eat what they want, or ameliorate some of the symptoms that are not fixed by a gluten-free diet. My department's about to get involved in a drug along these lines. So this is what we do. We stick our endoscope through the stomach into the small intestine, and we get biopsies all the way into the small intestine. And it was not that long ago people would have a little wire that swallow with a capsule on the end. It was a bit like a fishing hook, and we'd wait about 8 hours till it got into the small intestine, and then we'd snap it and it would lock, and we'd hope the fishing hook got something. So now we just do these biopsies. It's a lot easier for our patients. So These are normal, nice villi under the microscope, and these are these flat, damaged villi. And that's why they don't have they lose bits to absorb. This is the skin disease they can get, which is very nasty. It's not that common, but it really is terribly nasty. And so some people have gut symptoms when eating food with substances containing gluten, even if they don't have celiac disease. So we use this term non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is not a biologically or scientifically defined term. We don't know what it means, and it upsets people with celiac disease. So the symptoms of non-gluten, they're quite similar. People get the same abdominal symptoms, but there's no evidence that the immune system is involved. It doesn't damage the lining of the gut. You can't see anything on the biopsy, and there's no diagnostic tests. And there's debate whether it's actually the gluten causing these symptoms or not. And there's a lot more work on diet, and Geraldine may want to mention FODMAPs, and I'm not going to go through all the diet, but these are various sugars, sugar-based compounds and complex sugars that are often found in gluten-containing foods that do elicit a response, particularly if people malabsorb fructose. So it's something that sort of sits out there, and we're not sure what it really means. So I've asked to mention inflammatory bowel disease and ulcerative colitis. So that's a talk in its own right, and I'm not going to give a comprehensive talk. This is really about, I think, where gut health and maybe the microbiome, I think Ruth wanted me to talk more about. So inflammatory bowel disease is really an umbrella term used for any inflammatory disease of the gut, and the two main ones are ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, which are becoming increasingly more common. They're much more common than they were 10 or even 20 years ago. So Crohn's disease favors the lower part of the small bowel, but it can occur anywhere from the mouth to the anus, and ulcerative colitis is confined to the colon, but they're related conditions. And there's a number of medications we use quite commonly to mostly quite successfully treat these illnesses. So I've really been asked about health and diet. So we know when people have a diseased colon with inflammatory bowel disease, they shouldn't have a high fiber diet. It's really irritating the colon, and a low fiber diet is recommended. On the other hand, once the disease is stabilized and under control, we know there's huge benefits from a high fiber diet, and a high fiber diet is recommended. In certain circumstances, we'll support a low FODMAP diet, because if they have, a lot of these people have coexisting IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and they may benefit in certain circumstances from a low FODMAP diet, and Geraldine will talk about that in more detail. There are mouse models of inflammatory bowel disease which suggest a low-fat diet produces a healthier microbiome. We don't know if that makes the person healthier, and we don't know if that limits their disease in any way. There's been a lot of studies on omega-3 fatty acids, and really there's no evidence that improves health outcomes in these people. Similarly for curcumin, because the amount of curcumin you need to consume would be impossible to consume. There's no evidence that a low sugar diet is beneficial. We'd like to think it is, but there's no evidence it does. And there's some evidence for a FODMAP diet if diarrhea and bloating predominate once the disease is medically controlled. So, there's some work on prebiotics, and it's to try and grow the beneficial bacteria, and these are the most tested, and you may want to elaborate, Geraldine, tested prebiotics, these fructose oligosaccharides and the galacto-oligosaccharides. And dietary supplementation with these increases this healthier bacteria. There is a literature to show, but this is in animal models, that prebiotics do benefit the inflammation of the colon, not the small bowel, but so far, there's very little evidence in human inflammatory bowel disease. There's a single small pilot study I could find which did a randomized controlled trial and actually showed in this small trial, actually giving this potentially healthy probiotic, the patients did worse. So it just shows you how little knowledge we have, even though there's a lot of excitement about this. So far, dietary supplementation with prebiotics hasn't shown to benefit Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. And it's probably much more complex because there's all this, these human genes which have certain protective functions that they code for within the cells and our immune defenses. And there's this relationship with the gut microbiota which may be changed in some patients with inflammatory bowel disease. So it's exciting to think that probiotics offer a method to potentially alter the microbiome and give us a beneficial outcome in people with intestinal inflammation. But actually, there's actually very little evidence to a benefit of probiotic microbes in people with Crohn's disease, and there are just as many negative studies, so people having negative outcomes, as there are positive studies. And in large part, it may be due that we just don't know which are the best ones to give. So, there's insufficient evidence to support the use of probiotics in the maintenance of remission for Crohn's, for ulcerative colitis, except in one situation where people with ulcerative colitis have had their large bowel or colon removed surgically to treat the disease, and they have a bag or a pouch. They get a condition called pouchitis sometimes. And a specific probiotic has shown a benefit over placebo, and this probiotic is called VSL number 3, and it's very hard to get in Australia. It left the market for a long time. So it's a talk on its own right, fecal microbial transplants. So just to tell you that we probably don't really understand this very well, and we need long-term prospective, long-term follow-up, well-designed clinical trials versus sham or placebo. So that's, intervention. A sham is the placebo where you pretend you're giving something, and we don't know what the ideal route of administration, duration, frequency, and we don't even know about the long-term safety or efficacy. And I'm not going to talk further about that. I was asked to talk about drugs, and I wasn't sure what Ruth meant, drugs in the gut. So I'm not purely talking about the microbiome, telling you what some of the things we commonly see and know. Aspirin and non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, these are the Nurophens, the Voltarens, the Indacids of the world, can cause damage to the gastroduodenal mucosa via several mechanisms. But basically, they irritate the stomach directly, so they irritate the cells and cause inflammation and result in small ulcers either in the small intestine and the stomach, and in the small intestine, if people continue having anti-inflammatories, they get narrowing of the small intestine, which we call strictures, and get blockages of the bowel. In the stomach, where they more commonly cause problems, they cause stomach ulcers or gastric ulcers. They cause that directly through an irritant effect, but they also cause that indirectly once they reach the bloodstream. There's a protective process called prostaglandins, and anti-inflammatories inhibit prostaglandins. That's one of the benefits of anti-inflammatories, but they inhibit some of the good ones that protect the stomach from acid and ulcers. So that's what you get with these things. We get these little ulcers. This is the small bowel. So we've only been looking at the small bowel since we've had the Israeli invention of the pill camera or the capsule endoscopy. So we never used to know 15 years ago that you could get these things in the small intestine. But when people get them, there's no means of treating these. They don't respond to the standard treatment of a stomach ulcer. And if the person continues to consume anti-inflammatories, they get these, they look like spider webs, but it's hard and very tough tissue, which is a bit like fibrous tissue, and it blocks the bowel. So lots of drugs we commonly use can sometimes affect the gums. Calcium channel antagonists, so like verapamil can do that. Phenytoin is an anti-epileptic agent. Cyclosporin is an immunosuppressive agent, and they cause gum issues. This is alendronate is a drug and a class of drugs, the biphosphonates that help treat osteoporosis, and they can cause esophageal ulcers if not taken correctly. So, we've talked about colitis that can be caused by the Clostridium difficile bacteria when we treat it with antibiotics, and that's caused by a toxin released by this bacteria that's normally inhibited by the good bacteria. And I think I'm going to let Geraldine talk. I'm going to leave it at that.
Bloating, cancer, colitis, and diet. Our next guest speaker is, as Martin kept on introducing, Geraldine Georgeou. She's has a Master of Science in Nutrition and Dietetics. She's involved in 2 city clinics in Cobra and Bondi Junction. And she's looked at people with insulin problems, fertility, healthy weight management, and of course issues around food intolerance, childhood obesity, and family nutritional health. She's involved in the clinics at Prince of Wales Hospital, and also worked with the Gut Foundation, and has been part of the Gut Foundation Gut Cookbook. So we'll now hand you over to Geraldine to talk about gut-wrenching problems. What can you do? Thank you, Geraldine.
Thank you so much for having me this evening. I've recognised a few faces. It's all about hormones, weight and bowels, I say, every day in my office. So I'm always talking about these gut-wrenching problems, and as you can imagine, if you've got a chronic health problem, often you go look for food and nutritional problems or nutritional help, and being able to see if you can even cure thyself with food. But as we know, it's about what disease you have and being able to design an eating plan that's right for your health condition. So you can read a lot of books out there, but it's really important to get that really good medical advice, know where your starting point is, and then really understand what dietetic advice is evidence-based, and you're looking for not just a short-term outcome, but a long-term health outcome, and that's what we want to aim for, and quality of life. So we know that really irritable bowel is a lot of the symptoms that we deal with day to day, and it may not be a disease in itself. So, for example, IBS is a collection of symptoms which doctors will link together into one disorder. Obviously, after you've been screened, you have the gastroscopy, colonoscopy, and blood pathology, and histology, and assays, and all the things that they like to do. 1 in 7 people suffer from IBS. So often you might go to the doctor and think there's something terribly wrong. You go from your GP to the gastroenterologist, and they just say, you just got irritable bowel. And you sort of think, well, why do I feel so, I was going to say the word horrible, but at the end of the day, these symptoms may be abdominal pain, they could be diarrhea, could be gas, they could be wind, variable bowel habits, urgency, to even empty the bowel. I'm married to a Greek man. A lot of Greek men are lactose intolerant. He likes ice cream. 23 years of it I've had so far. Anyway, but 25% of cases of IBS start even after an episode of gastroenteritis. And one of the things that Professor Weltman mentioned was that we're all travelling, and so we're all going to all these weird and wonderful places. And have a wild guess what food I see patients experience gastroenteritis from. Anyone got a guess?
India.
Warm. It's served warm, it shouldn't be, by the way. Sushi. Oh. It's raw, it's warm, and it's manhandled. Anyhow. So we can be stressed, and so we all know, I know when I do a bit of TV work, especially when I do live TV, oh my godfather, I know about my gut access, let me tell you, when you're live on TV. Stress can definitely have an impact. But it also affects 30% of the population at some time in their life, commonly between 20 and 60 years, usually before the age of 40 years. But I'm sure Professor Weltman would agree that I'm seeing a lot of people well over 60 that are thinking they've got irritable bowel, but it could be fecal loading and chronic constipation. And they might be getting a variation of types of stools, but they could have what they call fecal overload because they've actually got constipation. So it's really important, if there's any change in bowel habit, seek your advice of your doctor. So when we look at the role of IBS and bloating and all those gut-wrenching problems, we're looking at, as we alluded to, the role of fibre. And one of the main messages I got from Professor Weltman's talk was that fibre is really important. And guess what? We're not eating enough fibre. We really aren't. And why do you think that? Why do you think we're not eating enough fibre? What are we all doing? What are we all being told? Low carb is good for you. Is it? What body part are we killing off? Our bowel. So it's all about the total, the type of fibre. We're looking at food intolerances. A lot of people think, I've got a sore tummy, I've got an allergy. Is it really an allergy? Is it really a food intolerance? What about fluid intake? And often through winter, see a lot of my patients and they're just not drinking enough fluid. But is it really a fluid thing? Not usually. Vitamins, some people might start taking vitamins because they think it's really helping them. A number of people I have that start taking magnesium. Guess what happens if you have too much magnesium? You'll know, you'll run to the toilet. You'll get the squirts, as my mother would say. You've got low FODMAP diets. They do have a role. But how long should we be on a low FODMAP diet? Is it just a short-term thing? Is it a long-term thing? And making sure that if you are going to try on a low FODMAP diet, work with an accredited practicing dietitian. Because it's not fun. And how long do we want to do it for? And what's the gain, what's the benefit? Gut microbiome we've talked about, and the role of probiotics, and it's still a learning area. We talked a little bit about that fecal microbiota transportation, and obviously with Professor Weltman, the information is very still new, and long-term studies are still very needed. Regularity of meals, just eating regularly and understanding how your bowel works in reference to peristalsis. Activity, that is being active, and where to get help. So the implications on our lifestyle is really important. I have people that are so debilitated with their bowel health, they don't want to leave their house. It can be very debilitating. Now, interestingly about total fibre, and I've got contact details if you want to contact me, because I've got a really good fibre checklist that I can email to you, because we don't really know how much fibre we need a day, and we'll talk about different fibres in a moment, but we need at least 30 to 40 grams of fibre per day. And I'll go through a typical day of eating at the end of the talk, just to give you a few tips. But there are different types of fibres, and there's insoluble fibres and there's soluble fibres. Now, insoluble fibres are interesting ones. You've got mixed grain bread, you've got rice bran, vegetables, fruit with skin on them, nuts and seeds. And what they do is they resist breakdown, absorbing water to soften stools, and they create bulk, increasing the rate at which bowel contents move through, as mentioned before. Have a guess what one we could eat that we know if it's doing its job? Corn. Corn's a good one. If you want to know how your transit time is, you can check it out at the end of the day or the next day. Soluble fibre. So legumes. We all know what happens when you eat baked beans. Pectins, guar gum. These are broken down by bacterial enzymes and improve environment of the gut. And they are a prebiotic, which is what Prof was mentioning. And as we know, the byproduct of what we excrete is actually the digestion of our bacteria, of our fibre. It's the waste product from our bacteria munching our fibre up. So it provides a feeling of fullness, adding bulk to stools, and more importantly for those people with diabetes, it can help control blood glucose levels and cholesterol levels and stimulate that bowel muscle contraction. Now, resistant starch is mentioned briefly, grain, seeds, lentils and potatoes. Now, interestingly, if we get a cold potato, it's actually got more resistant starch than already cooked. So you've got to cook it, make it cold, and then you might have potato salad out of it, it'll have more resistant starch in there. And that actually helps produce helpful fatty acids called butyric acid, and that adds bulk to stools and stimulates bowel muscle contraction as well. A lot of research with resistant starch, reducing inflammation and looking after the cells in our bowel. So fibre, how can we manage better fibre intake? Well, we can certainly choose fresh fruits rather than fruit juices, and don't peel fruit if it's not necessary. Making sure we're using beans and barley and other pulses and legumes to soups and casseroles, and rissoles, but you might find you need to make sure you prepare them well, because if you don't rinse them enough, you might find you'll have more starch in your meal, and you might get more gastric symptoms. Don't rely on just lettuce salads. A lot of people say, oh, wait till it's summer, I'll have more vegetables in the form of salad. Well, that's actually not going to increase your fibre like you think it does. And then making sure you're using things like cold potatoes, stuff with resistant starch, and even consider food supplements. So a lot of people may need that extra top up because they can't actually, or don't realise they're not going to ever get that 30 to 40 grams of fibre a day, so metamucil and bedding fibre and fibres that often people use. Now, the types of fibres we have, so fibre binds water, but this property is lost when it's split and absorbed. So brain retains its ability to bind water, which can complicate fibre studies as well. But no doubt fibre increases stool bulk and frequency and decreases the consistency, so making sure that we've got a regularity. It can help reduction of mean transit time, so meaning the type of fibre, you'll have a better transit time or will travel through your bowel, increase your stool weight. Tolerance of insoluble fibre versus soluble fibre is questionable. Some people have trouble with insoluble fibre, so we need to get a combination for some people. And then soluble fibres such as selenium are better tolerated. So back to food intolerances. So we've got lactose, which I've alluded to, and you can simply find that out if you've had a gastroscopy and your gastroenterologist is looking to see if you've got any enzymes missing. They might tell you you've got no lactase enzymes. I have some patients that come to me and they've found out they've got isomaltase and sucrase deficiency, which is always a challenge. That means they've got other enzymes missing. You have windy foods, just generally. Before we knew all this information about FODMAP, for example, and I had an irritable bowel patient, it might be that I need to have a look to see just how many windy foods they're having. They might have too much cabbage every day, and everyone wants to eat cabbage in the form of fermented sauerkraut. Get ready for maybe just getting windy, because that's quite normal. Brussels sprouts and cauliflower, for example. I've got so many patients having cauliflower at Do we really like cauliflower rice? I'm not sure about it still, personally. They're full of polyols, but anyhow. Dietary lectins is another area of food intolerances. There's gluten intolerances, and as mentioned before, being non-celiac gluten sensitive. And the question is it the protein in the wheat or is it the fructan in the wheat, which is the starch or the carbohydrate? Is it just simply eating too much fat? You might have an underlying gallbladder issue and you're not aware of that, and you've got what we call steatorrhea after having just too much fat. Better tolerance of insoluble versus soluble. So you think you've got a food intolerance because you're trying to fix your food with fibre, but again, which fibre are you having? Now, I find this is an interesting topic. Some patients find that they might get quite loose bowels quite a lot, and this is when we're looking at the role of low FODMAP and osmotic load. Our bowels are very clever. The human intestine can handle 7 to 10 litres of fluid each day. So it washes in, washes out, it's like a dam. Has anyone had a whooshka moment? Run for your life? Don't know where it's all coming from? That could be that you've had an osmotic load, or we could even use the word dumping experience. The available data do not suggest that stools can be manipulated to a clinically relevant extent by modifying fluid ingestion though. So we need to always make sure we're hydrated. So if anyone does have lots of loose bowels, back to that, keep hydrated, but just upping your fluid intake doesn't necessarily help your bowel situation. And there's no evidence that constipation can successfully be treated by just increasing fluid either. So some people just say, I just need to drink more water if I'm constipated, but it's much more complex than that. So again, magnesium can have a laxative effect, so be mindful. A lot of patients might use cyprium to help with IBS symptoms, and then also fibre supplements. So the dreaded low FODMAP. Hands up here that's tried low FODMAP. Yeah? Did you find any help, benefit? There's a no, there's a yes. So the idea of it, a lot of research has come from Monash University, and they found that different foods can ferment. So we've got fructose, fructans, lactose, GOS foods, and polyols, and you can get a whole range of symptoms with those. So that was the osmotic load, increased water delivery, increased in extension. You might have, if I may say, without irritating anyone, poo, lots of poo or too much poo. And then what happens is at the end of the day, you'll find that you're not sure what food is causing the problem. Or you might have lots of gas, bloating, pain discomfort or wind. Knowing which of these food groups that can actually create this problem, the idea of the low FODMAP diet is that you actually have to eliminate all those starches, get into a space where motility seems a bit better, that is, opening your bowels, it's not too urgent, it's not too regular, it's just right, as they say. You find that your symptoms are getting better, and then what happens is you then need to reintroduce each food group singly to try and work it out. There are hydrogen breath tests that you can do to see if you're actually fermenting, say, fructose or lactose. There isn't a breath test for fructans or the GOS, and that's a really big food group. So FODMAPs, in summary, are rapidly fermentable short-chain carbohydrates with a high osmotic effect. The oligosaccharides are basically the group of fructans and galacto-oligosaccharides. The disaccharides are lactose, monosaccharides are fructose, and the polyols are sugar, alcohols, and artificial sweetener. So you might have noticed when you look at diet drinks, it says in excess has a laxative effect. That's because you might be walking into a polyol experience. FODMAPs are poorly absorbed in the intestine for some people, and they can either create a slow or low capacity transport with the fructose, where you can have a reduced activity of brush water hydrolases found in your small bowel for lactose, or lack of hydrolases for fructans and GOS foods, or the molecules could be just too big for simple diffusion for polyols, which means you have that osmotic effect and your body can draw water in there. There's lots of companies out there that make low FODMAP foods now. There's also the Sue Shepherd range, and it's not about I need to eat low FODMAP for the rest of my life though. It's all about looking at what, when and why and how long and what have I achieved on a background of balanced eating, adequate fibre. Now interestingly, fructose malabsorption can be common in healthy subjects as well. So we all know when it's been peach season. I know you all like your peaches, your yellow clean peaches. So we all know we can have an experience of upset tummy with too much fruit, for example, and malabsorption doesn't always equal symptoms. So people can be asymptomatic. I've had patients that have been told by their gastroenterologist that they've actually got issues but they were unaware. And people with IBS can have a highly sensitive gut nerve ending and brain that listens to visceral hypersensitivity. So some people think they've got IBS and everything, but it's because their gut axis has been triggered. And I don't know if Professor Weltman will say this, but there are medications too to die down the symptoms in your gut if that's the end point of the problem with medication. And patients with IBS may not be sensitive to all low FODMAP. So usually I say to patients, if they're on a low FODMAP diet or want to embark upon a low FODMAP diet, we might do it for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we start looking at reintroduction. Hopefully they become symptomless or symptom-free or less symptoms to help them then navigate through it to reintroduction to then a balanced eating plan. Okay, so this was a video, this is a Norman Swan video about gut microbiome, but I think we've covered that topic quite well tonight. So if you get home, if you want to do a little Google Norman Swan gut microbiome. And just as we were mentioning before, the gut microbiome is a collective term for the range of microorganisms that live within the human gut and form an ecosystem. So imagine you've got a whole little habitat living in your gut. And that's why we need to look after it. So each environment within the gastrointestinal system has different microbiomes, and as we mentioned, the largest concentration inhabits the colon, and after the brain, the gut has the largest nerve system. So when you feel crook in the gut, you really can feel quite crook. And the gut microbiome is complex, and we're still learning about it. There's 10 times as many microbial cells versus human cells. So we're really just one big gut microbiome, just so you know. And rapid changes occur in the gut microbiome as many microorganisms will only live for days or hours. So there is a big turnover for your gut microbiome. Now, I found this interesting. So there's 3 signs of a healthy microbiome. So the diverse types of bacteria need to live there. Bacteria feeding off carbs, not protein. So back to my story before, what are we doing to our bowels when people say, I can't eat carbs? That's very sad. We're destroying all these people that live in there. So we can't do that. So supporting the gut microbiome helps manage many chronic health conditions, and also there's emerging evidence showing neurological health as a benefit and anxiety and depression. So a diverse carbohydrate fermenting microflora is protective against pathogenic incursions. So without having all our people in there, then we may end up having issues with our health, from immune health problems and so on. So we're learning about it, and there's still lots more to be learned. So what can we do? So choosing wholemeal or whole grain, fibre-boosted white breads. Look for on a label a source of fibre. If you see a source of fibre written on a label, it means it's got a source of fibre, and they have to stand by that. We need to choose a high fibre breakfast cereal or whole grain cereal or muesli, or look for at least 2 grams of fibre per 30 grams, or at least a Health Star rating of 4. So if you remember seeing the Health Star rating on your labels, choose wholemeal instead of white varieties, and wholemeal flour when cooking pasta, brown rice rather than white. Again, similar to before, fresh fruits, keeping the skin on there, the legume family, try not to just have salads, and make sure you've got resistant starch as a form of fibre in your diet as well. Now, that was a little bit about fecal microbiota. As we all know, the idea of it was to use the healthy human flora to support bad bacteria, recolonization. It's a very interesting area. They say it may help certain conditions, but it's still very experimental. And we also know that some of the research is a very interesting one. It's a bit icky, I think, but it's usually a processed stool from someone else that's put into you through a colonoscopy via rectal enema. So we don't know how many times you need to have it done, we don't know how long you have to have it done, and we don't know the long-term outcome. So it's still very experimental. We mentioned that there are 2 probiotics that we know exist in our gut flora, and there has been some antibacterial, antiviral activity, exert anti-inflammatory effects on mucosal surfaces, and potentially could alter the composition of gut flora. But once, as Professor Weltman was saying, once you stop taking them, they're not there anymore. So it's about how long we have to do that for. So it's all about supporting already what your gut microbiota is. Now this is interesting, all my dieters. The regularity of eating is very important. 80% of low amplitude propagated contractions occur during the day. So it's good to move around, it's good to get up in the morning. There's a significant increase after meals and after morning awakening. So I have so many patients that might go, I miss breakfast because I'm doing intermittent fasting and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. Well, they're upsetting their low amplitude propagated contractions, I call them. Well, I don't really, but now I will. But at the end of the day, in 25% of subjects, these waves will be accompanied by emission of flatus. So it's actually fine to have wind because it means you're functioning, but it's all about understanding, is this normal, is this not normal? But the whole thing about intermittent fasting, all about no carb, low carb, avoiding meals, not eating regularly, could be just danger. We know physical activity is very important. I mean, there's all this interesting information in the media about people running, jogging, and doing something else in someone's driveway. You might have heard about all that. It's not very nice. That's because when you're running, you do create colonic motor function, which changes in then the regularity. So wakefulness and colonic activity goes hand in hand. And population data do support the notion that those who undertake more physical activity have less incidence of constipation. And then in the elderly, constipation then is exacerbated by their poor mobility, which then also can be part of their depression and everything else. In healthy subjects, moderate increased activity does not change bowel function, but vigorous physical activity such as marathon running will increase gut, including colonic activity, and this can lead to a dramatic increase in large bowel function. So I wonder how they all go with all those races. But it just goes to show you that they need to really work with a dietitian, I'd say. Moderate physical activity may help individuals with mild constipation, but there's no evidence that more severe constipation has helped, because there might be another condition underlying. Bowel function may correlate to some extent with physical activity, but other cofactors such as diet and even personality. Okay, so here's an example of a meal plan of just getting it, I've got fibre in, and also about balance. And I'm all about making sure you have a balance of protein, low GI carbs, and good fats per meal. So for example, eggs on toast, small fruit with skin on. Some people might just have some yogurt for morning tea or lactose free, depending on who we're talking to. We might have some tuna and salad, make sure there's lots of veggies, but also the grainy bread and even a piece of fruit to follow. We might even have a nice grainy fruit toast, going to make it exciting, and sausage cheese on the side. Could be reduced fat cheese if you're worried about the saturated fat. And then maybe some lean red meat and some veggies, making sure there's a good selection. I should say 1 to 2 cups of veggies per meal. And then adding, I put the corn there because of the insoluble fibre. It could have been potato with skin on it, it could have been other vegetables, or some brown rice. And then you might have some milk at night. So what do we do? How do we help each other? So we need to be empathetic and caring. You know, it's not just simply going away and eat more fibre and drink water. It could be a combination of issues that need to be addressed. Be hands-on, so really look at your food, really look at your balance, really understand your health situation that you're in. Identify your food habits, where you're falling down. Very happy to send you out a fibre intake chart. You can have a look at it for yourself. And then we look at your lifestyle and see if you're moving around and looking after yourself. Where to get some help? The Dietitians Association of Australia, you can go to their website, see Dietitian near you. You can look at the low FODMAP app, the Monash University FODMAP app on your phone. It's sort of like the one that's being utilised as the main one. And then there's me. That's it.
Thank you. And a wealth of knowledge and information. So we're going to invite our 2 speakers to come out to the centre here. We'll have some roving microphones. Hospital, when you're there, has a very strong, healthy food plan, kosher, that's the first thing. But secondly, we have an excellent consultant dietitian in Linda Cummins. Just want to introduce Linda. So many of you have been at Wolper, we enjoyed our food, and also looking at our diet that Geraldine put up, having been there, very similar, watching what's good for you. If you're diabetic or have colon problems, etc. So just ask Linda. Would you like to make any comment, please?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Geraldine and Prof. People like Geraldine and I, being dietitians, get very excited about food. And I've been associated with Wolper for probably 30 years, and I still get very excited about the food that we offer at Wolper. Hopefully you guys have perhaps tried it. So I like to think that the food we provide at Wolper is like the fertiliser for your gut. There's a reason that the Wolper tree looks like the Wolper tree. So we provide fertiliser or healthy food for your tummy by way of very fresh food. The food is cooked within 2 hours of you receiving it. Nothing is held over, nothing is left over, nothing is cold chilled, nothing is preserved. We keep a minimal intake of preservatives, and particularly a very mindful of emulsifiers, which are getting a bit of a bad rap at the moment with gut health. We like to keep the traditional foods because, being culture, we obviously have the salad meal of the chicken soup and the challah, which is white challah. I don't think anyone's making whole or whole grain challah. And the smoked salmon. But I like to think that I've spent all these years manipulating the menu at Wolper so that we incorporate the science and the better health clinical practices. So you will see on our menu that there are lots of options of higher fibre. We include a lot of whole grains like barley and buckwheat and quinoa in our menu. We manipulate the menu so that we can incorporate lots of the appropriate health things that we're seeing. So resistant starch, every 7 main meal dish at Wolper contains legumes, whether it be chickpeas, lentils, edamame beans, to incorporate resistant starch. We're also aware that we can individualise the menu so that if you have clinical needs where you perhaps are coming in with acute inflammatory bowel disease, that we could put you on the low residue, low fibre diet to adapt it as well. So hopefully we can accommodate all ranges of special diets. So when I'm not at Wolper, I also, like Geraldine, I'm in practice as well. So that's where I guess we try and keep food very interesting and try and practice the best practice at Weltman.
Thank you. Okay, so there will be some questions from the floor, so who'd like to start? No gambles here? There's one down the front. Thank you.
Just want to ask the effect of the antibiotics. The antibiotics on the stomach, whether we should, when you take the antibiotics, you should as well take probiotics to just counteract the damage on the stomach of taking antibiotics.
So the question is whether we should be taking probiotics with our antibiotics.
So it's quite debatable because different antibiotics affect the gut microbiome in different ways. So it becomes quite. We often say antibiotics and we put them into a single package, but an antibiotic for your skin may be a different antibiotic for your lung and a different antibiotic for your bowel, and the probiotics you're going to take are really the two main commercially available probiotics, which may or may not get damaged by those particular antibiotics. So although we often do that, there's no strong or hard evidence that that's a beneficial thing to do. There's no science behind that. So we're not actually giving most of the broader range of probiotics we need to do. You can only really commercially get two main probiotics. So is there a downside of taking that? Probably not, but we don't know. And is there a benefit of taking that? We don't know.
Do we need to take the lactobacilli enhanced yogurts? Well, that's the other one people often take.
It may be more practical to do that at a more practical way. You're getting the protein and the other dietary components as part of your diet, and you're having the probiotics that way. But even taking the probiotics, they may get damaged by the antibiotics anyway. So I'm not sure there's much science behind that. It's become something we do.
Question from down the front?
So should one stop taking probiotic?
Sorry?
Should one stop taking a daily probiotic tablet if there's no benefit?
Well,
We do take baby probiotics.
no, stop taking a regular probiotic, you say?
Yeah, a regular probiotic.
So I don't stop my patients taking probiotics if they're hooked into taking probiotics, but it's not something that that everyone should necessarily have. There's no evidence that everyone should be on a probiotic, and that each of us sitting here should be on a probiotic. There may be some specific medical need that your doctor has suggested you may benefit from, but just taking a probiotic would be the same as just taking an iron tablet or a vitamin D tablet if you don't need vitamin D.
Thank you. Cool.
Is Iberogast one of those, is it probiotic?
Iberogast is not a probiotic. It's really a cocktail of herbs, yeah, basically, that mixed into a certain formulation, and they've made it as a liquid, as if you've seen Iberogast. So there is some evidence for Iberogast, to be fair to them. No one knows how it works and how it benefits health, but they have shown in people with what we call functional dyspepsia, which is the upper gut equivalent of irritable bowel. They have shown a benefit versus placebo in controlled trials. So most people who make supplements don't, unlike pharmaceutical companies, they don't spend that level of money to test they don't have have to go through several phases of clinical trials and placebo-controlled trials. But to be fair to the people who have Iberogast, there is benefit to Iberogast in specific situations. And there is a specific study looking at diarrhea-predominant irritable bowel syndrome as well. So Geraldine talked about diarrhea-predominant. You get constipation or diarrhea-predominant people have mixed IBS, both diarrhea and constipation. But there is some evidence for that particular product.
Michelle?
I've been told that if you are taking antibiotics, you shouldn't take the probiotic at the same time. What's the time that you should allow lapse between taking the antibiotic and taking the probiotic?
So I would tend to agree with you that it wouldn't be the best time to take the probiotic while you're on antibiotics. And it really depends on the antibiotic. So all drugs have what we call a half-life, how long they stay in your body. Most antibiotics will be out of your system within 24 hours. So if you're going to take it, you should take it after 24 hours of completion of the course.
Okay, question?
I was a bit surprised you didn't mention anything about Campylobacter or Helicobacter. It was a Nobel Prize in 2005, Dr. Warren and Marshall, and it's quite prevalent, and there was no mention about that.
Yeah. The reason it wasn't mentioned, there were specific topics I was given, so I'm happy to come back and talk about those, but Helicobacter would be a whole talk in its own right. We wouldn't do justice to talk about Helicobacter, just to give it one or two slides because of the significant importance it's had on human health. It should be an independent talk on its own.
Isn't it part of the gut? It's the whole problem that we've got.
It's not part of the gut. It's a pathogen that fortunately is becoming less and less frequent, and it's slowly disappearing from most affluent medical Western societies. So it's fortunately becoming less common, but we'd have to do it. It's a Nobel Prize winning finding that would have to do it justice. We'd have to do a talk really on Helicobacter on its own right. It would be dismissive.
We talked about this evening was to look at what are common problems, and I think gastric ulcers is where Helicobacter comes in. So it's quite a specific topic, and I think for many people here, we thought that it's more about the issue about fecal transplant, is that what I need? Probiotics, is that what I need? In general, what's good for your gut is we are what we eat. And I think certainly in my day, in general practice, early days I actually did trials at St Vincent's where we showed that the new antacids went into the integument, those drugs are important. And then Professor Marsh came up with the fact that there's a bacteria there that must be eradicated in order to reduce gastric ulcers. But it's a whole story. So we heard it on the side. What's more general?
It's being eradicated. It's got to be reported.
We take your point, and we will talk.
It's not a notifiable illness. No, it's not reported to the government. It's not a notifiable.
It is.
It's not. It's not a notifiable illness.
Anyway, we thank you for your comment,
I'm sorry,
and we'll take it on board.
Because I had it twice.
It's not a notifiable illness.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions at all? It's a very important topic, gastric ulcers. There's no argument there.
I was interested to hear Geraldine's comments about some nationalities being more lactose intolerant, and that possibly there was an enzyme deficiency causing that. Could you expand on that a little bit, and is it curable?
I'd love to be curable. Is it curable, Professor Weltman? Yeah, there are that. So, yeah, have you got a pen? Oh, I'm surrounded by you all. So there's different groups of people that are more prone, so with the Asian groups and is it Jewish as well? So yeah, so unfortunately we don't know what causes it.
So everyone was lactose intolerant until about 10,000 years ago, and they've looked at this historically now, and there was the people who, mainly Northern Europeans at the time, there was selection and Darwinian theory in a sense, and evolution allowed people to acquire a series of digestive enzymes. So we cannot absorb, humans can't absorb, and most mammals can't absorb complex sugars. And lactose, like sucrose, like maltose, like fructose, are complex sugars. And we have to have enzymes that are coded for genetically in our small intestine, in those villi, in those cells, are little pockets of enzymes that when we're exposed to these complex sugars, they break it down into simple sugars. Glucose is a simple sugar, so lactose is broken down into glucose and a substance similar to glucose, and they're easily absorbed. So it's genetically coded for those ethnic groups have a low prevalence of the gene for lactase, which is the digestive enzyme. So those people who are lactose intolerant by race or by ethnicity, it's genetically determined. It doesn't always, and because we're born that way, we don't understand why some people might present at 2 years of age, some people at 20 years of age, some people at 50 years of age, etc. Why people suddenly start getting symptoms. So is there some environmental trigger or whatever? But those people who are lactose intolerant by race or ethnicity have a deficiency in the enzyme that's genetically coded, and you can't fix it. And it's the same if they're sucrose intolerant or maltose intolerant. Those are very rare conditions, and fructose intolerance will be the same thing. So it's quite common in Ashkenazi Jews. It's quite common in people that live around the Mediterranean, so Greeks, Lebanese, Syrians, etc., from that area. It's reasonably common in Asians, and they've been exposed to a lot of milk now, so they're going to have all those issues. And it's common in certain parts of Africa as well. But
What about celiac disease? Is it temporary?
Celiac disease is not genetic, it's temporary because you destroy those villi, but once you dietary comply, those villi get back to normal. But they're not just lactose intolerant, they're intolerant to anything that needs to be digested.
So often when I see patients newly diagnosed with celiac disease, I usually try and make them feel a bit better that if they've been told they're lactose intolerant at the start of their newly diagnosed celiac, I go, well, the good news is that your villi structure should grow back and your lactase enzyme concentration should return. So that's one little bonus with a lifelong gluten-free eating.
Thank you. Another question on the back.
Hi. I'm aware that this is probably also a subject on its own. You briefly mentioned depression and mental health in diet. Is there anything briefly you can give of importance for mental health and well-being in diet and the relevance of it and what we can do?
So, yeah, it is definitely a talk in itself, but definitely in reference to mental health, obviously having a happy tummy, gut health is very important. Secondly, diabetes is a big area in reference to depression and diabetes. From a dietetic perspective, it's all about balance. And I always say to any patient, any person that I see, whatever dietary program or health needs you have, having energy, having a balanced protein, low GI carb, good fat meal plan, making sure you understand what that looks like per meal over a day, not missing meals, not being on fast food and takeaways. All those sort of things do add up in reference to your wellness and well-being. So, very important.
I think what they did show is that regular exercise and diet is going to improve your mental health. And that's been shown. A number of people talk about relieving their depression with very regular exercise and finding a good diet for themselves.
And I think
that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, if you've got chronic mental health issues, working with a doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist, activity, but also nutrient deficiencies, like, if you've got low iron, you're going to feel pretty horrible. You've got low vitamin D, low B12, all those things. So really looking at your medical, nutrition, lifestyle in your head. That's what I say.
Okay, so unfortunately it's close to 9 o'clock and these are the closing here for us. I wanted to say thank you to our guest speakers, please. And I sincerely thank you all for turning up tonight. Our next talk will be on the 14th of November.